Dearest listeners, if you find delight in these tales of hearts and drawing rooms, do grant this humble chronicler the kindness of your approbation, a touch upon the like, a pledge to subscribe, for such encouragements sustain the chronicling of society's most delicious intrigues. Now, to our tale. There exists no creature more dangerous than a woman convinced she must triumph over her own sister. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most cautionary tale of sibling rivalry transformed into romantic folly, wherein two accomplished young ladies of breeding nearly sacrifice genuine devotion upon the altar of wounded pride. But let us not rush to judgment, for the transformation of vanity into wisdom, like the cultivation of the rarest orchid, requires patience, careful observation, and occasionally the sharp pruning of truth. The summer of 1816 arrived at Hartwick Manor with the subtle anxiety that accompanies genteel poverty. One must understand that the Hartwick family existed in that precarious position where respectability remained intact whilst fortune slowly diminished, rather like a once magnificent tapestry whose golden threads had begun, imperceptibly at first, to tarnish. Lady Margaret Hartwick, widowed these 3 years past, surveyed her Hampshire estate with the practiced eye of a woman who calculated expenditures whilst maintaining appearances, a delicate ballet performed by countless mothers of the gentry throughout England. The late Sir Charles Hartwick had possessed more refined taste than business acumen, investing heavily in agricultural improvements that yielded prestige rather than profit. His sudden demise from apoplexy had left his widow with 2 unmarried daughters, a modest income from tenant farms, and the pressing awareness that advantageous marriages represented not merely social aspiration, but practical necessity. Yet Lady Margaret refused to permit desperation to taint her daughter's prospects. The Hartwicks maintained their position through careful economy, disguised as preference, attending only the most select gatherings, citing refined sensibilities rather than diminished resources. Lady Beatrice Hartwick, at 24, possessed the kind of beauty that revealed itself gradually, like dawn breaking over the Sussex Downs. Her countenance reflected intelligence rather than mere prettiness, with gray eyes that assessed the world with penetrating clarity, and dark hair she wore simply, disdaining the elaborate arrangements favored by more frivolous young ladies. She had inherited her father's scholarly inclinations, spending hours in the library that remained Hartwick Manor's greatest treasure, its shelves lined with volumes on natural philosophy, classical languages, and contemporary literature. The county acknowledged her as exceptionally accomplished, though certain matrons whispered that excessive learning rendered young ladies unmarriageable, their minds too formed to accept proper wifely submission. Beatrice cultivated her intellectual reputation with the same care other young ladies devoted to their complexions. She contributed essays to regional journals under a carefully maintained pseudonym, corresponded with several bluestockings in London, and could discuss Plato's Republic with the same fluency she applied to more feminine accomplishments. Her pianoforte playing demonstrated technical mastery, if not passionate expression. Her needlework showed precision rather than artistry, and her watercolors captured botanical specimens with scientific accuracy. She moved through society with quiet dignity, speaking little but observing constantly, her sharp wit emerging in bon mots that entertained whilst occasionally drawing blood. Yet beneath this cultivated exterior dwelt an older sister's burden of comparison and competition. Beatrice had spent her girlhood as the sole focus of parental attention and expectation, only to witness that exclusive regard fragment upon the arrival of Lady Georgiana Hartwick, 3 years her junior. Georgiana possessed beauty that announced itself immediately, the sort that caused conversation to pause when she entered drawing rooms. Where Beatrice's attractions required contemplation, Georgiana's demanded instant acknowledgement. Golden hair caught sunlight and candlelight with equal radiance, blue eyes sparkled with natural vivacity, and her figure displayed the fashionable curves that empire waists were designed to flatter. She moved with unconscious grace, laughed with unaffected delight, and collected admirers as effortlessly as flowers collected dew. At 21, she had already refused 2 respectable proposals, secure in the belief that greater prospects awaited. The younger sister approached life as performance and conquest. She practiced her smiles before mirrors, studied the language of fans with the dedication Beatrice devoted to Greek, and maintained correspondence with friends positioned throughout the ton who supplied intelligence regarding eligible gentlemen. Her accomplishments leaned toward the ornamental. She sang with a clear soprano that brought tears to susceptible eyes, danced with such grace that partners felt themselves temporarily transformed into adequate dancers, and painted romantic landscapes that sacrificed accuracy for emotional effect. Where Beatrice sought to impress through erudition, Georgiana aimed to enchant through charm. The sisters maintained careful civility that barely concealed perpetual competition. They had learned early that their mother's affection, their father's pride, and society's approbation existed in finite quantities, requiring constant jockeying for position. Beatrice's first tooth, first word, first book read had represented triumphs until Georgiana's arrival shifted attention to the newer, prettier child. The elder sister had responded by retreating into intellectual achievement, carving a domain where beauty held no advantage. The younger sister, aware of her siblings' head start in parental favor, had weaponized her considerable physical charms. Years of such competition had poisoned what might have been natural sisterly affection. They observed each other's courtships with critical eyes, subtly highlighting each other's shortcomings in maternal audiences, and celebrated each other's disappointments with concealed satisfaction. Their mother, exhausted by failed attempts at reconciliation, had resigned herself to managing rather than mending the relationship, treating her daughters as diplomatic allies requiring careful balance rather than as family members capable of genuine unity. The household at Hartwick Manor functioned through established routines that minimized conflict. Beatrice claimed the morning hours for reading and correspondence, Georgiana the afternoons for social calls and shopping expeditions to Winchester. They took separate daily walks, attended different charitable committees, and cultivated distinct social circles that occasionally intersected at larger gatherings. Dinner conversation navigated carefully neutral topics: estate management, servants' efficiency, weather predictions, avoiding the dangerous territories of personal achievement or romantic prospects. Into this delicately balanced arrangement arrived news that would shatter their fragile equilibrium. Lady Margaret received a letter from her distant cousin, the Dowager Duchess of Pemberton, announcing that her nephew, Lord Sebastian Worthington, would spend the summer months at Pemberton Hall, the ducal estate situated a mere 5 miles from Hartwick Manor. The Dowager Duchess, aware of her cousin's circumstances and unmarried daughters, extended an invitation to various gatherings throughout the season, her words carefully worded to convey opportunity without the humiliation of obvious matchmaking. Lord Sebastian Worthington represented precisely the kind of prospect that caused ambitious mothers to sharpen their daughters' accomplishments and refresh their wardrobes. At 30 years of age, he had inherited from a maternal uncle both a barony and a considerable fortune derived from West Indian plantations and prudent investments. His father's death the previous year had added a substantial property in Oxfordshire to his holdings, establishing him as one of the more eligible gentlemen in England. More remarkably, he possessed the education, refinement, and conversational abilities that elevated him above the merely wealthy. He had completed the Grand Tour before war made it impossible, published papers on agricultural improvement, and maintained connections throughout the ton without displaying the rakish tendencies that plagued so many young men of fortune. The announcement of Lord Worthington's arrival transformed Hartwick Manor from peaceful coexistence into armed camp. Lady Margaret, recognizing the unprecedented opportunity, decreed that both daughters would attend every event to which they received invitation, their rivalry subordinated to family interest. She commissioned new gowns from Winchester's finest modiste, ordered additional candles for evening study and beauty treatments, and engaged the local dancing master for refinement lessons neither daughter believed she required. Beatrice responded to the news with apparent indifference, masking intense calculation. She researched Lord Worthington's published works, discovered his interest in classical archaeology, and prepared conversational gambits designed to display her own learning in complementary areas. She selected fabrics in subtle colors that suggested intellectual depth rather than frivolous vanity, and practiced an expression of thoughtful attention that conveyed intelligence without the intimidating intensity that frightened lesser men. If Lord Worthington sought an accomplished wife to grace his drawing rooms and educate his future children, she would demonstrate her superior qualifications. Georgiana approached the competition with equal determination and different weaponry. She studied Lord Worthington's lineage and connections, memorized the names and relationships of his associates, and crafted a persona of delightful femininity that promised charm without vapidity. Her new gowns employed the most fashionable designs, cut to display her figure whilst maintaining proper modesty, in colors that complemented her golden beauty. She rehearsed her laugh to achieve the perfect balance of amusement and admiration, practiced expressions of flattering attention, and prepared anecdotes that would showcase her wit without threatening masculine superiority. If Lord Worthington desired a beautiful ornament to enhance his consequence and provide agreeable companionship, she would prove herself the ideal selection. Neither sister articulated the obvious. They intended to compete for Lord Worthington's affections with the same ruthless determination they had applied to every previous contest. Their mother, pragmatic rather than idealistic, recognized the situation but chose not to interfere. Society permitted sisters to compete for the same gentleman provided they maintained outward propriety. Better both daughters pursue the same excellent prospect than waste the season on lesser candidates. One would triumph, securing the family's future, whilst the other would need to accept gracious defeat and seek alternative arrangements. The summer's opening event arrived with the regularity of ritual, the Dowager Duchess of Pemberton's annual garden party, that carefully orchestrated afternoon where local gentry mingled with visiting nobility under the pretense of admiring landscaping and sampling strawberries. Lady Margaret arrived at Pemberton Hall with her daughters, each prepared according to her individual strategy, their competition barely concealed beneath the thin veneer of sisterly unity. The Duchess's gardens displayed the impressive results of substantial investment and expert horticulture. Gravel paths wound through carefully designed vistas, leading guests past classical follies, ornamental ponds stocked with imported fish, and flower beds arranged in elaborate geometric patterns. Beneath a massive oak tree, servants had established tables groaning under refreshments, whilst a small orchestra played pieces by Haydn and Mozart from a strategically positioned gazebo. Perhaps 36 families wandered the grounds, their conversations creating a pleasant hum punctuated by laughter, and the occasional shriek of children permitted temporary freedom from drawing-room deportment. Lord Sebastian Worthington stood conversing with several local gentlemen near the Italian fountain, his appearance meeting and exceeding expectations established by rumor. He possessed the height and bearing that distinguished aristocracy from mere gentry, his figure displaying the athleticism of a gentleman who actively managed his estates rather than merely collecting rents. Russet hair worn slightly longer than current fashion suggested either continental influences or comfortable disregard for minor conventions, whilst blue eyes assessed his surroundings with intelligence and occasional amusement. His coat fit with the perfection that indicated London tailoring. His cravat achieved complexity without foppishness, and his overall presentation balanced fashionable awareness with masculine assurance. The Dowager Duchess, recognizing her cousin's arrival, performed the necessary introductions with practiced smoothness. Lord Worthington bowed with proper depth over Lady Margaret's hand, his greeting conveying respect without excessive familiarity. When presented to Beatrice, he held her gaze a moment longer than strictly necessary, his expression suggesting he registered her intelligence and found it intriguing rather than threatening. His bow to Georgiana demonstrated equal courtesy, though his eyes reflected masculine appreciation for her considerable beauty, a response she had learned to expect and exploit. The afternoon progressed through the prescribed rituals of polite society. Lord Worthington circulated among guests with the skill of someone accustomed to social obligations, distributing attention equitably whilst favoring none obviously. Yet observers noted that he lingered slightly in conversations with the Hartwick sisters, returning to their vicinity with greater frequency than chance alone might explain. He discussed recent discoveries at Herculaneum with Beatrice, demonstrating knowledge that challenged without condescending, and complimented Georgiana's gown with the discernment that separated genuine appreciation from automatic flattery. Beatrice deployed her intellectual arsenal with calculated precision. She mentioned her translation of Ovid, casually referenced correspondence with a notable Cambridge scholar, and offered observations about Roman agricultural techniques that related directly to Lord Worthington's published interests. Her grey eyes sparkled with genuine engagement when discussing ideas, her usual reserve melting into animated discourse that revealed the passionate mind beneath the cool exterior. She noticed his attention sharpening, his questions becoming more probing, his body language indicating increasing interest. Georgiana countered with her own considerable weapons. She laughed at Lord Worthington's wit with perfect timing, neither too enthusiastically nor too restrainedly. She touched his arm lightly when making a point, a gesture that acknowledged intimacy without crossing propriety's boundaries. She arranged herself to display her profile to advantage, employed her fan with the fluency of a native speaker, and created an atmosphere of delightful femininity that promised pleasure without complication. She observed his pupils dilating slightly when he looked at her, his conversation becoming more animated in her presence, his attention returning repeatedly to her figure. What neither sister noticed, absorbed as they were in their individual campaigns, was the presence of two other gentlemen who observed the proceedings with decidedly different expressions. Mr. Edmund Gray stood somewhat apart from the main gathering, his position reflecting his ambiguous status. As the local physician, he received invitations to such events based on professional respect rather than social equality. His father had been a respected apothecary in Winchester, his education funded by a patron who recognized exceptional intelligence in the shopkeeper's son. He had studied at Edinburgh, that repository of advanced medical knowledge, and returned to Hampshire to establish a practice that combined traditional remedies with innovative approaches. At 27, he had built a reputation for healing skill and absolute discretion, virtues that earned him grateful patience but not social peers. His appearance suggested scholarly dedication rather than aristocratic leisure. Tall and spare, with brown hair that persisted in falling across his forehead despite repeated attempts at order, he dressed with meticulous care that could not quite achieve fashion. His coat, though well-made, dated from several seasons past. His cravat achieved neatness without artistry. His hands showed the evidence of his profession, clean but slightly stained from medicinal preparations, calloused from the physical demands of his work. Yet his eyes, dark and remarkably perceptive, missed nothing, and his mouth, though often serious, suggested capacity for humor. Edmund Gray had loved Beatrice Hartwick for 3 years, from the moment she had summoned him to attend a tenant's child, and remained throughout the night assisting with his efforts, her steady hands and quick understanding proving invaluable. He had watched her intellectual brilliance with admiration, untainted by the masculine insecurity that caused other men to retreat from her erudition. He attended every salon and lecture where she might appear, contributed to discussions with insights designed to complement rather than overshadow her observations, and cherished every moment of conversation they shared. He borrowed books from Hartwick Manor's library, not because he needed them, but because returning them provided legitimate excuses for visits. Yet he maintained absolute silence regarding his feelings, recognizing the impossibility of his position. She was a baronet's daughter with ancient lineage and refined connections. He was a physician's son who worked for his living, whose hands touched disease and death, whose income derived from fees rather than rents. The social distance between them might as well have been the distance between earth and stars. He could no more offer for her hand than a sparrow could court an eagle. So he contented himself with hopeless devotion, treasuring every smile she bestowed, every conversation they shared, whilst watching her pursue gentlemen worthy of her station. Today he watched her direct all her considerable charm toward Lord Worthington, observed her animation in the Baron's presence, and felt the familiar ache of longing mixed with resignation. She sparkled for Worthington as she never did for ordinary society, her intellectual gifts deployed with strategic precision. Edmund recognized what she could not, that she performed rather than connected, impressed rather than revealed herself. But he said nothing, standing at the periphery of her awareness, loving her silently. Captain Thomas Dane occupied a similarly marginal position, though for different reasons. At 26, he had survived 5 years of brutal warfare against Napoleon's forces, emerging with a captaincy earned through courage rather than purchase, a slight limp from a wound received at Salamanca, and very little else. His father, a country squire of modest means, had secured him a commission through family connections, hoping military glory might compensate for lack of fortune. Thomas had indeed distinguished himself, mentioned in dispatches, respected by his men, but military honor did not translate into social currency in drawing rooms. His appearance reflected military life's austere demands. Broad-shouldered and compact, moving with the controlled grace of someone trained to react instantly to danger, he wore his regimentals because he could not afford fashionable civilian clothing. Sun and weather had tanned his face to an unfashionable brown, creating lines around eyes accustomed to scanning horizons for threats. His hands bore scars from sword and musket. His posture maintained parade ground straightness even in social settings, and his expression carried the wariness of someone who had seen too much death too young. Thomas had known Georgiana Hartwick since childhood, when both families had been more prosperous and social distinctions less pronounced. He remembered a fearless girl who climbed trees, collected frogs, and laughed without restraint. He had departed for war carrying her image in his heart, sustained through horror by memories of her brightness. He had survived battles that killed better men, driven by determination to return and declare feelings he had been too young to articulate when he left. He had imagined countless scenarios for reunion, perfected declarations, rehearsed approaches. Reality proved far more difficult than imagination. The girl he had known had transformed into a society beauty who barely acknowledged their shared history. She treated him with distant courtesy, appropriate to a childhood acquaintance who had fallen in circumstances, nothing more. She certainly did not reserve for him the dazzling smiles, the animated conversation, the focused attention she bestowed upon worthier suitors. He watched her pursue Lord Worthington with the sick certainty of someone witnessing disaster but powerless to prevent it, loving her hopelessly whilst she remained oblivious to his existence beyond polite acknowledgement. The garden party concluded with the customary expressions of gratitude and promises of future encounters. Lord Worthington, having distributed his attention with diplomatic skill, departed leaving both Hartwick sisters convinced of their individual success. Beatrice believed her intellectual display had impressed him deeply, while Georgiana felt certain her charms had captivated him completely. Neither recognized that they had performed rather than connected, competed rather than courted. The following weeks established patterns that would govern the summer's developments. Lord Worthington accepted invitations throughout the county, his presence transforming ordinary gatherings into significant events. The Hartwick sisters attended every function where he might appear, their competition intensifying as both accumulated evidence of his interest whilst neither secured definitive advantage. Their rivalry, previously managed through separate spheres, now collided directly and repeatedly. Beatrice organized a salon at Hartwick Manor, inviting Lord Worthington along with other intellectually inclined guests to discuss recent translations of Homer. She prepared extensively, ensuring the library appeared to best advantage, selecting topics that would showcase her erudition, arranging seating to place herself advantageously near their honored guest. The evening proved successful by her calculations. Lord Worthington engaged deeply in discussion, complimented her insights, borrowed several volumes from her father's collection, and accepted her invitation to return them personally the following week. What Beatrice failed to notice was Edmund Grey's presence at the salon, his contributions to discussion demonstrating not merely learning, but original thinking that earned approving nods from Lord Worthington himself. When the physician offered an observation about medical practices in classical Rome, Beatrice responded with automatic courtesy, but without the engagement she reserved for the Baron. When Edmund suggested a particularly obscure reference that perfectly illuminated her argument, she thanked him absently, her attention already returning to Lord Worthington. Edmund registered her indifference with the stoicism of long practice, content to orbit her brilliance even if she never noticed his light. Georgiana countered her sister's intellectual display with a musical evening, securing Lord Worthington's attendance through artfully casual mention of a visiting soprano from London. She selected her most becoming gown, arranged the drawing room's lighting to flatter, and positioned herself to display her figure while she performed. Her voice soared through Mozart and Handel with crystalline purity, her performance technically flawless and emotionally moving. Lord Worthington applauded with genuine enthusiasm, requested an encore, and remained afterward for refreshments where he praised her musical gifts extensively. What Georgiana failed to observe was Captain Dane's presence in the back of the room, standing because all chairs had been claimed by guests of higher social standing. His eyes never left her during her performance, his expression holding devotion so obvious that several matrons noticed and sighed sentimentally. When Georgiana finished, Thomas applauded with calloused hands that had held muskets and swords, but would have gladly held nothing but her. When she circulated among guests afterward, distributing thanks for compliments, she passed Thomas with barely a nod, her attention focused entirely on Lord Worthington's continued regard. The competition escalated with each passing week, the sisters abandoning even their pretense of separate campaigns. Every encounter with Lord Worthington became battleground, every conversation an opportunity to demonstrate superiority, every social gathering a chance to gain advantage. Their rivalry, previously conducted with some regard for sisterly obligation, devolved into open warfare constrained only by propriety's demands. At the Assembly Ball in Winchester, both sisters arrived determined to secure the maximum permissible 2 dances with Lord Worthington. Beatrice, exploiting her status as elder, claimed the supper dance and the final waltz through strategic positioning near him when the master of ceremonies called for sets. Georgiana, outmaneuvered but not defeated, secured the opening minuet and a country dance through the simple expedient of positioning herself directly in Lord Worthington's line of sight and employing a smile of such radiance that he could hardly avoid the implied request. The evening provided society with considerable entertainment. Observers noted the sisters' careful avoidance of each other, their separate courts of admirers, their studiously polite acknowledgments when proximity forced interaction. Certain matrons, possessed of both memory and cynicism, recalled similar competitions in previous generations, whispered predictions about outcomes, and placed figurative wagers on which sister would ultimately triumph. The consensus suggested that Beatrice's intelligence might prevail with a gentleman of Lord Worthington's scholarly inclinations, though Georgiana's beauty represented formidable competition. Beatrice danced the supper dance with focused intensity, directing conversation toward topics that displayed her erudition whilst flattering Lord Worthington's own knowledge. She referenced his published work on crop rotation, suggested improvements based on her reading of German agricultural texts, and created atmosphere of intellectual partnership that suggested how agreeable marriage to such an accomplished woman might prove. She noticed his attention remained steadily upon her, his questions probing and intelligent, his manner suggesting genuine interest rather than mere politeness. Yet during that same supper dance, neither Beatrice nor Lord Worthington observed Edmund Grey standing near the refreshment table, ostensibly conversing with another physician, but actually watching Beatrice with the focused attention of someone who studied beloved landscape for the 1,000th time, and still found new details to treasure. He noticed how her eyes sparkled when discussing ideas, how she unconsciously leaned forward when engaged, how her usually stern expression softened into something approaching joy. He memorized these details against future lonely evenings, knowing himself pathetic, but unable to stop loving her. Georgiana's opening minuet with Lord Worthington deployed different but equally effective tactics. She moved through the formal figures with grace that made other dancers appear clumsy by comparison, maintained expressions of delighted attention that suggested she found him uniquely fascinating, and interspersed the dance's conversation requirements with observations that demonstrated wit without threatening intelligence. She created impression of delightful femininity, combined with just enough cleverness to avoid vapidity, calculating that Lord Worthington, like most men, preferred women who enhanced rather than challenged their own consequence. Throughout Georgiana's performance, Captain Thomas Dane remained at the edge of the ballroom, lacking the social standing that would permit him to request dances with young ladies of quality without specific invitation. He watched Georgiana float through the minuet's elaborate patterns, remembered teaching her similar steps when both were children playing at adult sophistication, and felt the sharp pain of irrevocable loss. She had been his best friend once, his confidant, the girl who accepted him without regard for fortune or position. War had transformed him into someone she no longer recognized, or perhaps had revealed that childhood friendship meant nothing once adult priorities intervened. The weeks following the Winchester Assembly intensified the campaign beyond anything Hartwick Manor had previously witnessed. Both sisters rose earlier to prepare for potential encounters with Lord Worthington during morning rides through the countryside. Both stayed later at evening gatherings, hoping for private moments that might advance their causes. Both exhausted their wardrobes and their mother's patience, demanding new accessories, different hairstyles, enhanced presentation. Beatrice expanded her intellectual offensive, lending Lord Worthington books from her father's library with carefully inscribed notes suggesting complimentary reading, writing him letters discussing topics raised in conversation, and organizing expeditions to Roman ruins in the district that required his masculine guidance and protection. She positioned herself as intellectual companion, suggesting through accumulated evidence that marriage to her would provide lifetime of stimulating discourse and shared scholarly pursuits. One particularly memorable excursion took them to the remains of a Roman villa discovered on Pemberton lands. Beatrice arrived prepared with sketches of similar excavations, theories about the structure's original purpose, and enthusiasm that temporarily eclipsed her usual restraint. She scrambled over broken walls with unladylike eagerness, forgetting to maintain careful dignity in her excitement over a particularly well-preserved mosaic. Lord Worthington assisted her explorations with amused indulgence, clearly entertained by her passion, if not entirely sharing it. Edmund Grey accompanied the party in his capacity as the Duchess's guest, invited because his knowledge of local history added value to such expeditions. He watched Beatrice's unguarded delight with bittersweet pleasure, seeing her as she rarely appeared, free from society's constraints, pursuing knowledge for its own sake rather than for strategic advantage. He contributed observations about the site that demonstrated his own considerable learning, insights that Beatrice acknowledged with distracted courtesy before returning her attention to Lord Worthington. Edmund recognized that she valued his mind whilst remaining utterly oblivious to his heart. Georgiana pursued alternative strategies, organizing picnics in picturesque locations where her beauty showed to advantage against romantic landscapes. She secured Lord Worthington's escort to exhibitions of watercolors in Winchester, concerts at the cathedral, and garden tours of notable estates. She cultivated image of delightful companion, someone whose presence enhanced rather than complicated existence, whose beauty and charm would grace any drawing room whilst making no uncomfortable demands for intellectual engagement. One afternoon excursion proved particularly effective. Georgiana arranged a boating party on the river that bordered Pemberton Estate, ensuring that Lord Worthington would naturally offer to row her personally whilst other guests occupied different boats. She reclined against cushions in becoming disarray, parasol protecting her complexion whilst framing her features prettily, and created tableau of feminine grace that required masculine strength to complete. Lord Worthington rowed with athletic competence, whilst Georgiana provided admiring commentary on his skill, laughed at his occasional splashing, and generally made herself as agreeable as possible. Captain Thomas Dane rowed a separate boat containing elderly chaperones, his military training making him far more competent at the oars than Lord Worthington's aristocratic dabbling. He watched Georgiana's performance with the sick understanding of someone who recognized deliberate artifice where others saw natural charm. He remembered the real girl who had once waded creeks catching tadpoles, climbed trees to raid birds' nests, and demonstrated courage untainted by calculation. He mourned that girl whilst helplessly loving the woman she had become, even as he recognized she performed rather than revealed herself. The social calendar progressed through its predictable rhythms: morning calls, afternoon rides, evening entertainments. Lord Worthington maintained his position as most sought-after guest, distributing his attention with diplomatic skill that encouraged both sisters without committing to either. He accepted Beatrice's intellectual offerings with appreciation, engaged with Georgiana's charm with pleasure, and generally conducted himself with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to female attention. Yet certain observers, possessed of greater insight than the principals, noted peculiarities in Lord Worthington's behavior. He attended gatherings where the Hartwick sisters appeared, certainly, but he attended others where they did not with equal frequency. He accepted their various invitations and stratagems with courtesy, but without the focused intensity that marked genuine courtship. He seemed entertained rather than captivated, interested rather than smitten. Most tellingly, he frequently directed conversation toward the two men the sisters barely acknowledged, Edmund Gray and Thomas Dane, drawing them into discussions, soliciting their opinions, treating them with respect that exceeded their social positions. At a dinner party hosted by Colonel and Mrs. Pemberton, Lord Worthington spent nearly an hour conversing with Edmund Gray about advances in medical treatment, displaying knowledge of recent Edinburgh research that suggested serious interest in the subject. He questioned the physician extensively about his practice, his training, his ambitions, treating him as intellectual equal rather than social inferior. Edmund, unaccustomed to such regard from aristocracy, responded with cautious warmth, revealing in conversation both his brilliant mind and his fundamentally decent character. Beatrice, seated elsewhere according to precedence rules, observed this interaction with puzzlement tinged with annoyance. Why would Lord Worthington waste valuable social time on the local physician when he might converse with her? She dismissed the matter as masculine interest in practical subjects, failing to recognize that Lord Worthington learned as much from observing her reaction to Edmund's presence as from the conversation itself. Similarly, at a military review organized to honor returning officers, Lord Worthington sought out Captain Dane, questioning him extensively about campaign experiences, strategic decisions, the realities of command. Thomas, surprised by aristocratic interest in a junior officer's perspectives, gradually relaxed into honest discussion, revealing through accumulated anecdotes both his courage under fire and his profound decency toward the men under his command. Lord Worthington listened with respect that transcended rank, asking probing questions that demonstrated genuine understanding of military matters. Georgiana, attending the review primarily to wear a particularly becoming military-inspired ensemble, paid minimal attention to the actual soldiers beyond Lord Worthington. She noticed his extended conversation with Thomas with irritation, failing to understand why he would waste time on her impoverished childhood companion when he might admire her patriotic costume. She remained oblivious to the fact that Lord Worthington observed her reaction as carefully as he listened to Thomas's words. The season's social zenith arrived with the annual assembly at Pemberton Hall, an event that transformed the estate into fairyland through strategic deployment of thousands of candles, elaborate floral arrangements, and an orchestra imported from London. Every family of consequence within 30 miles received invitation, creating gathering that mixed aristocracy, gentry, and selected professionals in carefully calibrated hierarchy. The Hartwick sisters, recognizing the event's significance, prepared with unprecedented intensity. Beatrice selected a gown of midnight blue silk that suggested intellectual depth whilst displaying her figure to advantage. She arranged her dark hair in a style that combined classical simplicity with modern elegance, adorned herself with her grandmother's pearls, and approached the evening with strategic precision. Tonight she would secure Lord Worthington's specific attention, perhaps even advance toward an understanding. She had observed his growing interest, noted his frequent visits to Hartwick Manor, recognized the signs of masculine intention preparing to declare itself. Georgiana chose pale gold silk that shimmered in candlelight and complemented her coloring perfectly. She employed her maid's most sophisticated techniques, creating hairstyle adorned with silk flowers that suggested both artistry and accessibility. She selected jewelry that sparkled without overwhelming, perfume that hinted without announcing, and approached the evening with supreme confidence. Tonight, Lord Worthington would surely recognize her as the ideal baroness, the perfect ornament for his consequence, the wife every man desired. The sisters traveled to Pemberton Hall in pointed silence, each absorbed in final preparations and private calculations. Their mother, recognizing the evening's importance, had ceased attempting reconciliation and now simply managed the competition, praying that one daughter would secure an offer that would resolve their financial anxieties and end this exhausting rivalry. Pemberton Hall blazed with light, every window illuminated, every room opened for guests' pleasure. The main ballroom had been decorated with such extravagance that gasps greeted each new arrival. Garlands of white roses wound up columns, crystal chandeliers reflected candlelight into dancing rainbows, and the orchestra platform had been built up to create amphitheater effect. Perhaps 200 guests filled the space, creating that particular hum of elevated conversation characteristic of society gatherings. Lord Sebastian Worthington stood near the ballroom's entrance, greeting arrivals with his aunt the Duchess. His evening attire achieved perfection. Black coat cut to display his athletic figure, knee breeches and silk stockings emphasizing well-formed legs, cravat tied in intricate folds that suggested both fashion and masculine capability. He bowed over hands, exchanged pleasantries, and generally performed his social obligations with practiced ease. When the Hartwick party arrived, he greeted them with particular warmth. He complimented Beatrice's appearance with the specificity that suggested genuine attention rather than automatic courtesy, noting the classical influence in her styling. He praised Georgiana's beauty with the sincerity that caused color to rise in her cheeks. He offered his arm to escort them into the ballroom proper, positioning himself between both sisters in arrangement that might have appeared diplomatic, but actually created physical intimacy that thrilled both women. The evening progressed through its choreographed rituals. Lord Worthington opened the ball dancing with his aunt, as protocol demanded, then circulated through partners according to social precedents. Yet observers noted that he claimed both permissible dances with each Hartwick sister, along with a supper escort for Beatrice and a turn through the gardens with Georgiana. He appeared to divide his attention equally, favoring neither obviously, whilst both sisters felt certain they had received special consideration. Between formal obligations, however, Lord Worthington demonstrated unexpected behavior. He spent considerable time conversing with Edmund Grey and Thomas Dane, both relegated to social margins despite their presence as invited guests. He drew them into discussions with more prominent guests, casually mentioning Edmund's medical innovations and Thomas's military distinctions in ways that elevated their status. He treated them not as inferiors to be condescended to, but as equals whose company he genuinely enjoyed. Edmund Grey stood uncomfortably near the ballroom's edge, his position reflecting his ambiguous status. He possessed invitation and appropriate evening dress, but lacked the social confidence that would permit easy circulation. He watched Beatrice dance with various partners, studying her with the focused intensity of someone who had long since memorized every expression but could not stop looking. When Lord Worthington approached and engaged him in conversation about recent medical journals, Edmund responded with cautious warmth, grateful for aristocratic courtesy whilst remaining aware of social distance. Lord Worthington, however, refused to acknowledge that distance. He questioned Edmund extensively about his practice, his training at Edinburgh, his hopes for advancing medical knowledge. He listened with respect that transcended rank, asked probing questions that demonstrated genuine interest, and gradually drew from the physician information about his background, his ambitions, his character. When Beatrice passed nearby, Lord Worthington called her over, creating conversation triangle that included both the woman Edmund loved and the man she pursued. Beatrice joined them with automatic courtesy, prepared to discuss medical matters politely before returning attention to Lord Worthington. Yet, something unexpected occurred. The conversation deepened beyond pleasantries into genuine exchange of ideas about advances in surgery, debates about medical education, discussion of philosophical implications of new treatments. Edmund, freed from social constraint by Lord Worthington's interested encouragement, revealed the full force of his brilliant, innovative mind. He spoke passionately about his work, describing complex cases with clarity that made them comprehensible, articulating visions for improving care that demonstrated both intelligence and compassion. Beatrice found herself responding to Edmund's intellectual passion, despite her intention to focus on Lord Worthington. She contributed observations about historical medical practices, drew parallels between modern and classical approaches, asked questions that demonstrated she had actually listened to rather than merely endured his explanations. For perhaps the first time in their acquaintance, she saw Edmund Gray not as the convenient physician, but as the remarkable man, someone whose mind matched her own in capability, whose dedication to knowledge paralleled her own scholarly devotion, whose essential decency and goodness shone through accumulated conversation. Lord Worthington observed this interaction with careful attention, his expression holding the quiet satisfaction of a master gardener who had successfully grafted two compatible species and now watched the inevitable flowering. He guided the conversation with diplomatic precision, ensuring that Beatrice's considerable intelligence found worthy reflection in Edmund's passionate expertise, noting how each seemed to illuminate qualities in the other that remained dormant in lesser company. He noted how Beatrice's usual guardedness dissolved in genuine intellectual engagement, how her eyes sparkled when Edmund challenged one of her assertions, how her body language unconsciously shifted toward the physician rather than the baron. He noted also Edmund's barely concealed devotion, visible in every glance, every careful attention to her comfort, every contribution designed to showcase her brilliance rather than his own. The astute observer would recognize what neither principal admitted. They were perfectly matched in the ways that mattered whilst being impossibly divided by circumstances that did not. A similar scene unfolded in the gardens, where Georgiana had secured Lord Worthington's escort for a turn among the elaborate plantings illuminated by hundreds of paper lanterns. She had anticipated romantic interlude, opportunity for private conversation that might advance toward declaration. Instead, Lord Worthington guided their walk toward where Captain Thomas Dane stood alone on a terrace, staring out over darkened lawns with expression of barely concealed melancholy. Lord Worthington, displaying either remarkable insensitivity or deliberate strategy, invited Thomas to join their stroll. Georgiana, unable to protest without appearing ill-mannered, endured the addition with visible annoyance. Yet Lord Worthington seemed oblivious to her displeasure, immediately engaging Thomas in conversation about military campaigns, asking detailed questions about specific battles, drawing from the captain's stories that revealed both his courage and his humanity. Thomas, surprised by aristocratic interest and made bold by evening's extraordinary circumstances, gradually revealed himself with unusual openness. He described battles not with bravado, but with honest acknowledgement of fear and duty intertwined. He spoke of men he had commanded, their courage and their losses, with emotion barely controlled. He admitted his struggle to adjust to peacetime, his difficulty finding purpose without military structure, his sense of displacement among civilians who could never understand what soldiers had endured. Georgiana, compelled by politeness to attend their conversation, found herself listening despite her intention to remain focused on Lord Worthington. Something in Thomas's voice caught her attention, a raw honesty that contrasted sharply with drawing-room pleasantries. She remembered suddenly the boy who had been her closest childhood friend, who had taught her to skip stones and identify constellations, who had left for war with promises to return unchanged. She recognized with shock that war had indeed changed him, had carved away childhood's simple confidence and replaced it with adult understanding of mortality, duty, and loss. As Thomas described a particular battle where he had held dying men while they called for mothers and wives, his voice broke slightly. He recovered quickly, apologizing for introducing such grave subjects into festive evening. But Georgiana had seen his eyes in the lantern light, had recognized genuine grief beneath military bearing, had glimpsed the man beneath the uniform. For the first time in their adult acquaintance, she saw Captain Thomas Dane not as disappointing remnant of childhood friendship, but as someone who had endured horrors she could scarcely imagine and emerged with decency and tact. Lord Worthington observed this exchange with equal attention, noting how Georgiana's practiced charm faltered into something more genuine, how her usual performance dissolved into authentic human response, how her body language shifted almost imperceptibly toward Thomas when he described his struggles. He noted also Thomas's carefully controlled devotion, visible in how he addressed her, how he instinctively positioned himself to shield her from evening's slight chill, how his entire being oriented toward her even as he maintained proper distance. The assembly at Pemberton Hall concluded with both Hartwick sisters convinced of imminent triumph. Beatrice interpreted Lord Worthington's arrangement of extended conversation with Edmund Grey as sophisticated test of her intellectual flexibility, demonstration of the sort of salon she might host as his Baroness. Georgiana understood his inclusion of Thomas in their garden stroll as polite acknowledgement of childhood connections before moving forward into adult arrangements. Neither recognized what Lord Worthington had actually accomplished, forcing them to truly see the men they had consistently overlooked. The following morning brought unexpected development. A footman from Pemberton Hall delivered letters to both sisters, sealed with Lord Worthington's crest. Both women received their correspondence with racing hearts and immediate conviction that proposals awaited. They retired to separate rooms to read privately, each anticipating declarations of love and offers of marriage. Beatrice's letter contained courtesy and compliment, but nothing resembling proposal. Lord Worthington thanked her for delightful summer, praised her intellectual accomplishments, expressed hope that their acquaintance might continue as friendship. He mentioned plans to depart Hampshire within a fortnight, returning to his Oxfordshire estate to attend to agricultural matters requiring personal attention. He suggested that when next she visited London, she might call upon him and his betrothed, Lady Catherine Pembroke of Kent, whom he expected to wed by autumn. The words struck like physical blows. Betrothed. Lady Catherine Pembroke. Autumn wedding. Beatrice read and reread the letter, seeking alternative interpretations that might soften its message, finding none. He had been engaged all along. His attentions to her had been nothing more than pleasant conversation, intellectual exchange between acquaintances, social courtesy extended to his aunt's connections. She had misinterpreted entirely, built elaborate fantasies upon foundation of polite interest, convinced herself of importance where none existed. The humiliation proved crushing. She had spent the summer pursuing man who never considered her as potential bride, displaying her attractions and accomplishments for gentlemen already committed elsewhere, competing desperately with her sister for prize neither could win. She had organized salons, lent precious books, arranged expeditions, presented herself as ideal intellectual companion, all futile. Worse, she had structured her entire summer around this campaign, neglecting other opportunities, focusing every effort on securing Lord Worthington's regard. Georgiana's letter contained similar content with minor variations. Lord Worthington praised her beauty and charm, thanked her for making his Hampshire sojourn delightful, expressed hope for continued friendship. He mentioned his betrothal to Lady Catherine Pembroke, his forthcoming departure, his expectations for autumn wedding. He suggested she visit London during next season, where his wife would be delighted to expand her acquaintance among Hampshire families. Georgiana's initial response matched her sister's. Shock, disbelief, repeated reading seeking different meaning. She had been so certain of his interest, so convinced her beauty had captivated him, so secure in her ability to charm any man she targeted. His revelation of betrothal demolished her confidence entirely. He had never been available, never been prospect she imagined, never considered her as anything beyond pleasant summer acquaintance. She had wasted months in elaborate courtship of engaged man, competed viciously with her sister for nothing, convinced herself of conquest where none existed. Both sisters remained in their respective rooms throughout the morning, grappling with humiliation and disappointment. Their mother, aware something significant had occurred, waited for one or both to emerge and explain. She harbored her own disappointments. She had genuinely believed Lord Worthington might offer for one daughter, had built financial hopes around such outcome, had encouraged rather than restrained their competition. Now those hopes dissolved, leaving them exactly where they had started, but with summer wasted and sisterly relations damaged beyond easy repair. By afternoon, however, both women had progressed beyond initial shock into more complex emotional territory. Beatrice, possessing fundamentally honest character despite her pride, forced herself toward uncomfortable self-examination. Why had Lord Worthington's revelation hurt so deeply? Did she actually love the man, or merely desire the status and security his suit represented? When she pictured spending lifetime with him, did anticipation or duty dominate? Most uncomfortably, what had she really felt during that conversation with Edmund Gray at the assembly? Why had intellectual exchange with the physician sparked something Lord Worthington's polished courtesy never quite achieved? She recalled how Edmund's eyes lit up when discussing medicine, how his voice carried passion for his calling, how his mind engaged with hers in genuine exchange rather than mere performance. She remembered his contributions to her salon, always insightful but carefully phrased to enhance rather than overshadow her observations. She thought about his consistent presence at events she attended, his willingness to assist without expectation of reward, his obvious intelligence combined with profound decency. Then she remembered, with creeping shame, how she had treated him all summer. She had accepted his intellectual contributions whilst barely acknowledging their source. She had used his assistance at her salon to impress Lord Worthington whilst relegating Edmund himself to peripheral status. She had engaged his brilliant mind whilst remaining utterly oblivious to his heart. She had valued him as useful accessory whilst pursuing man whose interest proved illusory. Georgiana underwent similar reckoning. She forced herself to question why Lord Worthington's engagement stung so sharply. Had she genuinely cared for him beyond what he represented? Could she honestly claim to know his character, his genuine preferences, his inner self? Or had she pursued him purely as valuable commodity, proof of her superior beauty and charm? Most disturbing, why had Thomas's honest emotion in the garden affected her so powerfully? Why had his voice describing war's horrors moved her in ways Lord Worthington's polished conversation never achieved? She recalled Thomas as boy and man, his unwavering friendship before war, his steady loyalty upon return, his careful courtesy despite her obvious dismissal. She remembered teaching him to dance when both were children, climbing trees together, sharing secrets and dreams. She recollected his departure for war, his promise to return, her conviction they would resume their friendship unchanged. She acknowledged, painfully, how she had transformed into someone who valued status over substance, who dismissed childhood friend because he lacked fortune, who had become precisely the sort of superficial society beauty she had once scorned. As afternoon faded toward evening, an unprecedented event occurred. Both sisters, simultaneously and without coordination, left their rooms and found themselves facing each other in Hartwick Manor's upper hallway. They stood in silence, each recognizing in the other's expression mirror of her own humiliation and dawning realization. Pride demanded they maintain pretense, blame each other, or retreat to previous competition. Something else. Perhaps exhaustion, perhaps fundamental honesty, perhaps the relief of shared failure, prompted different response. Beatrice spoke first, her voice rough with suppressed emotion. She admitted her letter's contents, acknowledged her misinterpretation, confessed her humiliation. Georgiana, after moments' hesitation, offered similar admissions. They stood in the hallway, two intelligent women forced to confront their own vanity and folly, sharing space that felt safer than facing family or servants with news of their mutual defeat. Then something remarkable occurred. One of them, neither could later recall who began, started laughing. Not delighted laughter, but the desperate, slightly hysterical sound of someone confronting absurdity too large for other response. The other joined, and suddenly both sisters collapsed against the hallway wall, laughing and crying simultaneously, releasing months of tension and competition in uncontrolled outpouring of emotion. When they finally recovered enough for speech, silence hung between them for one long, trembling moment. Then Beatrice spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, confessing something that felt like betrayal of everything she had represented all summer. She admitted that she did not even particularly enjoy Roman ruins, that the elaborate discussions of archaeology and classical agriculture had bored her nearly to tears, that she had feigned passion for subjects she found tedious merely to impress a man who never truly wanted her. The absurdity of that small, sustained deception, maintained with such dedication for so many weeks, proved the crack that finally shattered their remaining pretenses. The floodgates opened. Beatrice confessed she had never actually enjoyed discussing archaeology extensively, that Lord Worthington's agricultural theories bored her profoundly, that she had performed rather than revealed herself all summer. Georgiana admitted she detested the constant vigilance beauty required, that she had worn corsets laced painfully tight and shoes that blistered her feet, that she had laughed at jokes she did not find amusing and pretended interest in subjects that left her cold. They acknowledged the cruel wager neither had explicitly stated, but both had privately maintained, that competition to prove which sister was superior, which more deserving of maternal pride, which more likely to secure advantageous marriage. They confessed how that competition had poisoned their relationship, transformed potential allies into enemies, wasted energy that might have built connection on rivalry that ultimately profited neither. Most painful and liberating, they admitted they had pursued Lord Worthington not because they loved him, but because winning him would prove something to each other, to their mother, to society, to themselves. They had competed for trophy rather than partner, performed for audience rather than revealing themselves, measured worth through masculine approval rather than internal value. As conversation deepened, other admissions emerged. Beatrice confessed with great difficulty her growing awareness of Edmund Gray's qualities, his brilliant mind, his genuine passion, his consistent kindness, his obvious devotion she had been too self-absorbed to perceive. She confronted, painfully, her fear of society's judgment should she consider physician husband, understanding that fear as fundamentally cowardly and unworthy. She admitted not knowing whether Edmund felt anything beyond professional courtesy, but wishing desperately she had given him reason to hope, rather than systematically discouraging through indifference any potential regard. Georgiana made parallel confessions about Thomas Dane. She described rediscovering during their garden conversation the person she had loved as childhood friend and somehow lost in transition to adult society. She confronted her shame at dismissing him because he lacked fortune, recognizing that priority as shallow and contemptible. She confessed watching him at assembly, noting how other young ladies sought his company despite his lack of wealth, observing his quiet dignity and genuine warmth, and realizing she had relegated him so consistently to the periphery of her awareness that she had likely extinguished whatever tender feelings he might once have preserved. The sisters talked through dinner hour, forcing their bewildered mother to dine alone whilst they remained upstairs, finally communicating honestly after years of careful performance. They acknowledged wounds they had inflicted on each other, apologized for cruelties subtle and obvious, admitted to jealousies and resentments that had festered unspoken. They perceived with new clarity how society had taught them to view each other as competitors for limited resources rather than potential allies in navigating restrictive world. As evening deepened toward night, they reached uncomfortable conclusion. They had wasted summer pursuing man who never wanted them while systematically dismissing men who might have genuinely cared for them. They had performed rather than connected, competed rather than courted, measured worth through conquest rather than genuine affection. Worst of all, they had likely destroyed any possibility that Edmund Gray or Thomas Dane might still harbor feelings beyond the polite distance their consistent dismissal had enforced. The following morning brought new clarity born of honest conversation and shared vulnerability. Both sisters woke early, finding themselves drawn to the garden where pale dawn light filtered through morning mist. They walked side by side in comfortable silence, each processing the enormity of their errors and contemplating what must come next. The courage required to approach Edmund and Thomas, to confess feelings and beg forgiveness, seemed mountainous in the cold light of day. Georgiana paused beside the rose arbor where she and Thomas had played as children, touching petals gone brown with autumn's advance. Her voice emerged small and frightened when she finally spoke, admitting her terror that Thomas might reject her, might have finally abandoned the devotion she had so carelessly spurned. Beatrice, standing close, confessed similar fears regarding Edmund, acknowledging that 3 years of indifference had surely killed whatever regard he might once have harbored. They stood together in mutual vulnerability, two women who had spent their lives competing now united in shared apprehension. Then Georgiana turned to face her sister directly, reaching for her hand with gesture that would have been impossible mere days earlier. She reminded Beatrice that courage had never been their problem. They had demonstrated courage aplenty in their foolish pursuit of Lord Worthington. The difference now lay in pursuing something genuine, rather than performing for imaginary audience. Whatever responses Edmund and Thomas offered, at least they would have spoken truth rather than maintaining comfortable lies. Beatrice squeezed her sister's hand, recognizing wisdom in her words. They exchanged looks that required no speech, acknowledgement of fear, commitment to honesty, promise of mutual support regardless of outcome. That silent exchange solidified their resolution, transforming anxiety into determination. They would face potential rejection with the same intensity they had brought to empty competition, but this time their efforts would serve authentic purpose. Georgiana made parallel confessions about Thomas Dane. She described rediscovering during their garden conversation the person she had loved as childhood friend and somehow lost in transition to adult society. She acknowledged shame at dismissing him because he lacked fortune, recognizing that priority as shallow and contemptible. She confessed watching him at assembly, noting how other young ladies sought his company despite his lack of wealth, observing his quiet dignity and genuine warmth, and realizing she had systematically destroyed any possibility that he might still harbor feelings for her. The sisters talked through dinner hour, forcing their bewildered mother to dine alone whilst they remained upstairs, finally communicating honestly after years of careful performance. They acknowledged wounds they had inflicted on each other, apologized for cruelties subtle and obvious, admitted to jealousies and resentments that had festered unspoken. They recognized how society had taught them to view each other as competitors for limited resources rather than potential allies in navigating restrictive world. As evening deepened toward night, they reached uncomfortable conclusion. They had wasted summer pursuing man who never wanted them while systematically dismissing men who might have genuinely cared for them. They had performed rather than connected, competed rather than courted, measured worth through conquest rather than genuine affection. Worst of all, they had likely destroyed any possibility that Edmund Gray or Thomas Dane might still harbor feelings beyond the polite distance their consistent dismissal had enforced. The morning following their reconciliation brought both sisters to breakfast table with altered demeanors. Gone was the careful performance and constant positioning. They moved through Hartwick Manor with quiet thoughtfulness, occasionally exchanging glances that conveyed shared understanding rather than rivalry. Lady Margaret observed these changes with cautious hope tempered by maternal pragmatism. Reconciliation pleased her, certainly, but solved none of their practical difficulties. Her daughters still needed advantageous marriages, their reduced circumstances still required resolution, and the summer's most promising prospect had proved illusory. The post brought additional correspondence that morning, including second letter from Lord Worthington addressed to both sisters jointly. They opened it together in the morning room, shoulders nearly touching in unconscious intimacy that would have been impossible mere days earlier. Lord Worthington's words conveyed courtesy and something more, a gentle challenge wrapped in aristocratic pleasantry. He wrote that his summer in Hampshire had proven enlightening in unexpected ways. He confessed having arrived already engaged to Lady Catherine Pembroke, committed by long understanding and genuine affection. His aunt's invitation to spend summer months at Pemberton Hall had provided welcome respite from London's intensity, whilst offering opportunity to observe Hampshire society before wedding responsibilities consumed his attention. He thanked both sisters for making his sojourn pleasant and intellectually stimulating, praising their respective accomplishments with specific detail that demonstrated genuine attention. Then his letter took unexpected turn. He suggested, with delicacy that softened but did not eliminate the observation's sharp edge, that the astute observer might note certain interesting patterns in Summer's social interactions. He mentioned, as if casual aside, how uncommonly brilliant was the local physician, Dr. Edmund Gray, whose dedication to medical advancement and depth of learning deserved wider recognition. He observed with similar apparent casualness that Captain Thomas Dane had demonstrated during their conversations courage and integrity, too rare among gentlemen of any class, qualities that should recommend him to anyone wise enough to value character over circumstance. He concluded by expressing hope that when he returned to Hampshire with his bride for autumn shooting, he might find his friends from summer all settled in arrangements worthy of their considerable merits. The letter's tone remained cordial throughout, yet underlying message proved impossible to miss. Lord Worthington had observed far more than either sister realized, had assessed situations they thought carefully concealed, and now offered subtle guidance toward outcomes he believed they truly desired. Beatrice and Georgiana read this second letter in stunned silence, each recognizing its implications. Lord Worthington had not been oblivious to Edmund's devotion or Thomas's regard. He had deliberately created situations forcing both sisters to truly see the men they had overlooked. His conversations with Edmund about medical matters, his inclusion of Thomas in garden walks, his careful positioning that created interactions between people systematically avoiding each other, all had been strategic rather than accidental. The urbane aristocrat had functioned as matchmaker whilst appearing merely sociable, had engineered revelations whilst maintaining plausible deniability. One must pause here to consider, was this an act of profound wisdom or supreme aristocratic arrogance? Perhaps, dearest listeners, it was a measure of both. Lord Worthington, like many of his station, viewed the social world as a chessboard, and he did not hesitate to move pieces toward what he deemed a superior outcome. Condemnable, some might argue, this manipulation of hearts and circumstances. Yet one cannot deny the result of his interference. 4 lives set upon a course toward genuine happiness, they had been too blind to find themselves. Sometimes, it seems, even arrogance can serve a virtuous purpose, and the line between meddling and mercy proves thinner than propriety might prefer to acknowledge. The sisters looked at each other, emotions mixing humiliation at being so transparent, gratitude for intervention they had needed, and dawning hope that perhaps their summer's damage might prove reversible. Yet significant obstacles remained. Even if Edmund Gray and Thomas Dane had harbored feelings, would those sentiments survive months of systematic dismissal? Would either man wish to pursue women who had demonstrated such shallow priorities? Could pride permit apologies and explanations sufficient to bridge the distance their behavior had created? More practically, society's constraints remained unchanged. Physicians and impoverished military officers did not typically marry baronets' daughters, regardless of personal regard. Lady Margaret, despite her newfound approval of sisterly reconciliation, would hardly celebrate matches that sacrificed social position for emotional satisfaction. The neighborhood would judge such unions as evidence of the Hartwick family's continuing decline. Both marriages would require confronting social prejudice, accepting reduced circumstances, and prioritizing personal happiness over conventional success. Beatrice, characteristically, approached the problem with intellectual analysis. She acknowledged loving Edmund Grey, or perhaps more accurately, recognizing she could love him if permitted to know him properly. His mind matched hers in capability. His dedication to knowledge paralleled her own scholarly devotion, and his essential decency created foundation upon which genuine partnership might build. Yet she possessed no certainty regarding his feelings beyond courteous professionalism. Physicians maintained many friendly relationships with families they served without harboring romantic inclinations. Perhaps Edmund's consistent presence at events she attended reflected merely an effort to cultivate goodwill among families of consequence, thereby expanding his practice among those who could afford private medical care. Perhaps she had imagined his devotion, projected her own growing feelings onto interactions he viewed through entirely different lens. She determined, nonetheless, to discover truth. Whatever embarrassment might result from declaring feelings not reciprocated, she refused to waste additional time in passive wondering. She would seek Edmund out, acknowledge her previous blindness, admit her growing regard, and accept whatever response he offered. If he rejected her, she would endure that pain with dignity. If he indicated any possibility of returned affection, she would pursue it regardless of social consequences. She had wasted summer on competition that profited no one. She would not waste autumn on cowardice. Georgiana reached similar conclusions through different reasoning. She recognized that Thomas Dane represented her best self, the girl who climbed trees and collected frogs, who valued courage and honesty over fashion and fortune, who chose friends based on character rather than consequence. She remembered their childhood intimacy with longing for simplicity they had shared before society taught her to want different things. She acknowledged that somewhere between girlhood and womanhood, she had lost essential parts of herself in pursuit of shallow goals society presented as worthy. Thomas, if he would still have her, offered return to authenticity she had abandoned. Life as military wife promised less comfort than Baroness lifestyle, certainly, but potentially more genuine satisfaction. She imagined using her organizational skills and social connections to benefit military families rather than merely advancing her own consequence. She pictured supporting Thomas's career not through ambitious positioning, but through genuine partnership. She envisioned life built on mutual respect and shared history rather than performance and pretense. Yet, like her sister, she faced uncertainty regarding Thomas's current feelings. His childhood affection had been clear and uncomplicated. His adult regard remained ambiguous, complicated by years of separation, war's trauma, and her systematic dismissal upon his return. He had maintained distant courtesy that suggested either persistent devotion, carefully concealed, or genuine indifference politely disguised. She could not determine which, without direct inquiry, and such inquiry required courage she had rarely demonstrated. She resolved, nonetheless, to attempt it. She would seek Thomas out, apologize for her treatment, acknowledge her mistakes, and reveal her feelings regardless of risk. If he no longer cared, she would accept that consequence of her own actions. If any possibility remained, she would pursue it with dedication she had formerly reserved for society's approval. She had been coward, choosing safe performances over risky honesty. She would demonstrate courage, even if late and inadequate. The sisters spent the following days in unusual collaboration, each supporting the other's frightening determination whilst confronting her own. They discussed strategies for approaching the men they had dismissed, practiced explanations and apologies, and generally strengthened each other's resolve. Lady Margaret observed these preparations with bewilderment shading toward alarm. When finally informed of her daughter's intentions, she responded with predictable horror. Match with physician? Union with impoverished military officer? Lady Margaret enumerated objections with practiced fluency. Social degradation, financial imprudence, neighborhood gossip, reduced circumstances, disappointed maternal hopes. Both daughters listened with patient courtesy, acknowledged her concerns' validity, and maintained their intentions regardless. They had spent too long prioritizing others' opinions over their own hearts. They would marry for love or not marry at all, consequences accepted. Lady Margaret, confronted with unprecedented united front, eventually yielded with exhausted resignation. She had raised her daughters to pursue advantageous matches, only to watch them select precisely opposite. Yet she recognized in their determination something she had not seen in years: genuine conviction and mutual support. Perhaps they were fools. Perhaps they would regret choosing love over security. But they would face those potential regrets together, supporting rather than undermining each other, and that unity represented its own kind of success. She looked from one resolute daughter to the other, and for the first time in years, saw not madness, but an unbreakable alliance. For years she had prayed for peace in her household, exhausted by the endless management of their bitter rivalry. And here was peace, forged in the fire of shared folly and mutual resolve. They were united. They were, despite everything, happy in their conviction, that peculiar, defiant happiness that transforms even foolish choices into acts of courage. Lady Margaret comprehended with shocking clarity that perhaps this unity, this fierce and joyful certainty they shared, was a dowry more valuable than any fortune or title she might have secured through strategic marriages. They had found something she herself had never quite achieved in her own careful conventional life: the courage to choose authenticity over approval. And watching them stand together, she understood that sometimes a mother's greatest success lies not in the matches she arranges, but in raising daughters brave enough to reject those arrangements when their hearts demand different paths. Beatrice chose the Winchester subscription library for her encounter with Edmund Gray, knowing he frequented the establishment to access medical journals his modest means could not justify purchasing. She arrived mid-morning on Tuesday, his customary visiting day according to intelligence she had carefully gathered. She wore her simplest day dress, attempting to suggest through appearance the honesty she hoped to achieve through words. Edmund stood in the periodicals section, absorbed in recent Edinburgh Medical Journal, when Beatrice approached. He looked up with his characteristic expression of cautious pleasure, prepared to exchange courteous greetings before returning to reading. Instead, Beatrice requested private conversation, her serious tone arresting his immediate attention. They removed to a corner alcove where leather chairs and relative privacy permitted genuine discussion. Beatrice had rehearsed her speech extensively, preparing logical arguments and careful explanations. Yet facing Edmund's patient attention and obvious confusion, her prepared remarks dissolved. Instead, she spoke with uncharacteristic bluntness, confessing her summer's folly, acknowledging her blindness, admitting her growing awareness of his qualities she had systematically overlooked. She described how Lord Worthington's deliberate intervention had forced her to truly see Edmund's brilliant mind, dedicated character, and consistent kindness. She confessed, fearing society's judgment whilst recognizing that fear as unworthy. She admitted not knowing whether he felt anything beyond professional courtesy, but needing him to understand that she had been blind, ignorant fool who finally perceived truth. Edmund listened without interruption, his expression progressing through surprise, disbelief, and barely restrained emotion. When Beatrice finally exhausted her explanations and fell silent, awaiting his response, he sat motionless for a long moment, clearly struggling to process revelations that contradicted 3 years of resigned hopelessness. Then he spoke, his voice rough with suppressed feeling. He confessed having loved her since that night 3 years past when she had assisted with the tenant's child, displaying competence and compassion that revealed her true character beneath society's polish. He described watching her at every gathering, treasuring each conversation whilst recognizing the impossible distance between physician's son and baronet's daughter. He admitted to himself that his consistent presence at events she attended reflected not merely an effort to cultivate goodwill among families of consequence, but desperate devotion carefully concealed. He admitted borrowing books from Hartwick Manor's library not for their contents, but for excuses to see her, returning them with inscribed notes he hoped she might read and somehow understand his feelings. He described the agony of Summer, watching her pursue Lord Worthington whilst remaining oblivious to devotion, literally standing beside her. He confessed nearly departing Hampshire entirely, accepting position in London that would remove him from daily torture of loving someone unattainable. Only professional obligation to existing patients and pathetic hope she might someday notice him had kept him from fleeing. Now, confronted with her unexpected declaration, he hardly dared believe his comprehension matched reality. Did she truly suggest possibility of understanding between them? Could she genuinely consider accepting addresses from someone so far beneath her social station? Would she truly risk neighborhood censure and reduced circumstances for physician husband? Beatrice responded with actions rather than words. She reached across the space separating their chairs and took his hand, a gesture that violated propriety whilst perfectly communicating her intent. She told him she cared nothing for neighborhood opinion, that she valued intellectual partnership and genuine devotion over social consequence, that she would far rather live modestly with husband who truly knew and cherished her than luxuriously with gentlemen who regarded her as decorative acquisition. For a long and painful moment, Edmund's mask of professional courtesy remained firmly in place, a shield forged through 3 years of hopeless observation. His mind, trained for diagnosis, assessed her with clinical precision, questioning whether this represented an impulse born of aristocratic guilt or genuine transformation of feeling. He had survived 3 years of loving her from the margins by accepting impossibility. He could not risk his heart's survival on a second misunderstanding. His silence stretched between them, heavy with accumulated years of careful distance, whilst his eyes searched hers for truth he desperately needed but hardly dared to trust. Then something in her expression, perhaps the trembling of her lower lip, perhaps the tears gathering in her gray eyes, perhaps simply the raw vulnerability of someone who had never before exposed herself so completely, finally breached his defenses. His own careful control crumbled, overcome by emotion he had suppressed for years. He could only sit holding her hand whilst attempting to comprehend his transformed circumstances. The woman he had loved hopelessly now offered herself freely. The impossible dream he had cherished while expecting nothing now materialized as potential reality. He acknowledged his modest income, his professional status, his inability to provide luxuries to which she was accustomed. Beatrice responded that she brought sufficient dowry for comfortable establishment, that she valued useful work over idle ornament, that she would far rather assist his medical research than preside over empty drawing rooms. They spoke for 2 hours, conversation ranging across hopes and dreams and practical considerations. Edmund described his ambition to establish modern hospital in Winchester, improving care for those too poor to afford private physicians. Beatrice immediately engaged with the concept, suggesting organizational strategies, identifying potential patronage sources, offering to contribute both financially and practically. They discussed sharing intellectual life, she assisting his research whilst pursuing her own scholarly interests. They envisioned partnership of minds and hearts, supporting each other's ambitions whilst building life based on mutual respect and genuine affection. When they finally departed the library, they did so as understood couple, committed to navigating whatever obstacles society might present. Edmund would speak with Lady Margaret formally, requesting permission to court Beatrice despite his modest circumstances. They would endure neighborhood gossip and maternal reservations. They would accept reduced social status and simplified lifestyle. Yet they would face those challenges together, secure in knowledge that they had chosen genuine partnership over conventional success. Georgiana's approach proved characteristically different, more dramatic, and less calculated. She had learned through careful inquiry that Captain Thomas Dane had accepted temporary quarters at the Pemberton estate, assisting with security arrangements for anticipated autumn shooting party. She determined to seek him there, recognizing that private conversation required she venture beyond propriety's usual constraints. She rode to Pemberton Hall alone, dismissing chaperone and propriety in favor of necessity. She found Thomas inspecting the estate's boundaries, planning guard positions, and coordinating with gamekeepers. He looked up with surprise when she approached, his expression carefully neutral as he bowed with proper courtesy. She requested private conversation, her serious tone concerning him sufficiently that he immediately agreed, leading her toward ornamental garden where stone benches provided seating whilst remaining technically visible from the house. Unlike her sister, Georgiana had not rehearsed speeches or prepared arguments. She had decided during her solitary ride that only complete honesty would suffice, that Thomas deserved truth rather than performance. So she simply began speaking, words tumbling out in uncharacteristic disorder. She apologized for her treatment of him since his return from war, acknowledging she had dismissed him cruelly and unjustly. She confessed her summer's folly, describing the competition with her sister and their mutual pursuit of gentlemen who had never been available. She admitted how Lord Worthington's intervention had forced her to recognize what she had deliberately ignored, that Thomas represented everything she had genuinely valued before society taught her to want different things. She described remembering their childhood friendship, climbing trees, catching tadpoles, sharing secrets and dreams, and realizing she had sacrificed authentic connection for shallow social success. She acknowledged that somewhere between girlhood and womanhood, she had lost herself, becoming person she did not particularly like in pursuit of goals that ultimately satisfied no one. She confessed watching him at the assembly, hearing him describe war's horrors, and recognizing the boy she had loved had become man she could admire and respect if given opportunity. She admitted not knowing whether he harbored any feelings beyond childhood memory and polite distance. She acknowledged earning his indifference through her own systematic dismissal. But she needed him to know that she had been wrong, blind, foolish. She needed him to understand that if any possibility remained, any chance he might consider forgiving her mistakes, she would pursue it with dedication she had formerly wasted on meaningless social triumphs. Thomas listened with expression that progressed from surprise through pain towards something approaching hope. When Georgiana finally exhausted her explanations and sat awaiting his response, he remained silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with emotions too powerful for easy articulation. He heard her with the stillness of a soldier on sentry duty, his face an impassive mask that revealed nothing save a flicker of old pain in his eyes. Years of her polite dismissals had constructed a fortress around his heart, stone by careful stone, and her words, however sincere they might sound, represented the first volley against ramparts he had long considered impenetrable. The captain in him demanded caution and strategic assessment, even as the man beneath cried out for the hope she dangled before him like salvation. Could he trust this apparent transformation? Would she maintain this conviction when neighborhood gossip began, when her mother's disappointment became reality, when the reduced circumstances of military life replaced the comfort of Hartwick Manor? He had survived 5 years of war's brutality. He was not certain he could survive loving her again, only to watch her retreat once more behind society's comfortable walls. Then he spoke, describing how he had carried her image through 5 years of brutal war, sustained by memories of their childhood friendship and dreams of returning to reclaim connection they had shared. He confessed how his homecoming had shattered those dreams, revealing the girl he remembered had transformed into society beauty who barely acknowledged his existence. He described watching her pursue various suitors whilst treating him with distant courtesy that hurt more than outright rejection would have done. He acknowledged considering remaining in military service, accepting posting that would remove him from Hampshire entirely and end his daily torment of loving someone unattainable. Only his promise to deceased comrades that he would survive and return to England, honoring their sacrifice by living fully, had prevented him from seeking dangerous assignments that might resolve his unhappiness permanently. He confessed that summer had been particularly agonizing, watching her compete desperately for Lord Worthington, whilst remaining oblivious to devotion standing literally beside her. He admitted his garden conversation with her at the assembly had both thrilled and tortured him. Thrilled because she seemed briefly to truly see him. Tortured because he recognized the moment as temporary aberration rather than genuine recognition. He acknowledged considering remaining in military service, accepting posting that would remove him from Hampshire entirely and end his daily torment of loving someone unattainable. Only his promise to deceased comrades that he would survive and return to England, honoring their sacrifice by living fully, had prevented him from seeking dangerous assignments that might resolve his unhappiness permanently. In that moment, Georgiana understood the true nature of the burden he carried. She perceived with devastating clarity that her superficiality had not merely wounded him, it had unknowingly dishonored the memory of men who had died so that he might return home. The redemption she sought was not merely for her own heart, but for his and for theirs. The weight of that realization settled upon her shoulders like a mantle, transforming her shallow regret into something far more profound. Genuine comprehension of duty, sacrifice, and the sacred responsibility of being truly seen and valued by someone who had paid such terrible prices for the privilege of living and loving. Now, hearing her unexpected declarations, he struggled between hope and protective cynicism. Could he trust this apparent transformation? Would her feelings survive once neighborhood gossip and social consequences materialized? Could she genuinely accept military wife's reduced circumstances after lifetime of relative privilege? Georgiana responded with characteristic directness. She acknowledged understanding his doubts, accepting them as earned through her own behavior. She could only promise that her feelings were genuine, her commitment real, her willingness to accept consequences sincere. She would not ask him to trust immediately. She would prove herself through actions over time, demonstrating consistency that words alone could never achieve. Thomas, confronting possibility he had long since abandoned as impossible, felt years of resignation and protective indifference crumbling. The woman he had loved hopelessly now offered herself with honesty that suggested genuine transformation, yet he maintained one final concern. Propriety required he secure permission to court her, approaching her mother with proper formality despite his inadequate circumstances. He possessed small income from military pension, insufficient for supporting wife in comfort to which baronet's daughter was entitled. He could offer only modest establishment, hard work, and absolute devotion. Georgiana laughed, the genuine delighted sound Thomas remembered from childhood, nothing like the calculated performance she had perfected for society. She told him she cared nothing for grand establishments, that she valued authentic partnership over comfortable boredom, that she would far rather live modestly with husband who truly knew and loved her than luxuriously with stranger who valued only her appearance. They talked through afternoon, rebuilding connection that society and circumstance had damaged but not destroyed. Thomas described his military experiences with honesty he had never shared with civilians, trusting Georgiana with darkness he carefully concealed from polite society. Georgiana revealed her own struggles, pressure to marry well, competition with sister, constant performance social success demanded, exposing vulnerabilities she typically guarded carefully. They rediscovered childhood intimacy whilst acknowledging adult realities, building foundation for partnership between equals rather than continuation of juvenile friendship. When they finally parted, they did so as committed couple, understanding that significant obstacles remained, but determined to confront them together. Thomas would approach Lady Margaret formally, requesting permission to court Georgiana despite his modest means. They would endure social consequences and maternal concerns. They would accept reduced circumstances and potential ostracism. Yet they would face these challenges as partners, supporting each other through difficulties whilst building life based on genuine affection and mutual respect. The following weeks brought exactly the complications both couples anticipated. Lady Margaret, confronted with not one but two unsuitable matches, alternated between resigned acceptance and renewed objections. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip. The Hartwick sisters, failing to secure Lord Worthington, had settled for physician and impoverished soldier in arrangements that confirmed the family's declining fortunes. Certain matrons pronounced the matches scandalous, others viewed them as romantically imprudent. Still others saw them as practical accommodation to reduced circumstances. Yet both couples persisted with determination that surprised doubters. Edmund Grey approached Lady Margaret with humility but not apology, acknowledging his modest circumstances whilst detailing his prospects and absolute devotion to Beatrice. He produced financial calculations demonstrating his ability to support wife comfortably, if not luxuriously, described his professional ambitions with clarity that suggested genuine capability, and generally presented himself as worthy husband regardless of social status. Lady Margaret, perceiving her daughter's unwavering commitment and Edmund's obvious quality, eventually granted grudging approval. Thomas Dane made similar petition regarding Georgiana, describing his military pension and prospects with painful honesty whilst offering assurances of absolute dedication. He possessed even less financial security than Edmund, but compensated with character references from commanding officers and demonstrated courage that suggested capacity for building successful civilian career. Lady Margaret, already resigned to one unsuitable match, accepted the second with weary acknowledgement that her daughters would have their way regardless of maternal preference. The neighborhood's initial scandalized response gradually moderated as both couples demonstrated genuine devotion and practical competence. Edmund Grey's medical skill ensured continued professional respect even as his marriage elevated social status. Thomas Dane's military distinction earned him consideration that poverty alone might have denied. Both men proved personable, intelligent, and decent, eventually earning acceptance, if not enthusiastic approval, from Hampshire society. The weddings occurred within months, modest celebrations that prioritized meaning over ostentation. Beatrice married Edmund in Hartwick Manor's chapel, surrounded by family, close friends, and Edmund's numerous grateful patients who regarded him with affection bordering on reverence. She wore simple white silk rather than elaborate gown, choosing substance over show in gesture that perfectly expressed her priorities. The ceremony included readings from Greek philosophy and medical texts, creating a blend of intellectual and spiritual that suited both partners perfectly. Georgiana married Thomas in the Garrison Chapel, military ceremony that honored his service whilst celebrating their union. She wore pale blue silk and carried wildflowers, reminiscent of their childhood rather than society's expectations. Thomas wore his regimentals, medals earned through genuine courage displayed with quiet pride. Several of his surviving men attended, providing honor guard that moved spectators to tears through its simple sincerity. Thus, each sister wed not in performance for society's approval, but in declaration of who they truly were. One, surrounded by books and ideas, married the very mind she had once been counseled to conceal behind feminine accomplishments. The other, encircled by loyalty and honor, married the courage she had always secretly admired, but only recently learned to emulate. Their ceremonies reflected not what they thought they should want, but what their hearts had always desired once pride's blindfold finally fell away. Both couples established households that reflected their values and circumstances. Beatrice and Edmund occupied comfortable house near his Winchester practice, sufficient for their needs without pretension to grandeur. She transformed one wing into library and research space, assisting Edmund's medical investigations, whilst pursuing her own scholarly writing. They hosted intellectual salons that attracted interesting minds regardless of social position, creating community based on ideas rather than status. Their life together combined professional partnership with genuine affection, proving intellectual equals could build marriage of remarkable depth. Georgiana and Thomas lived in modest cottage on military grounds, accepting reduced circumstances with grace that surprised skeptics. She organized charitable work supporting military families, employing organizational skills society had taught her toward meaningful purpose. Thomas transitioned successfully to peacetime military administration, his experience and integrity earning steady advancement. Their life together balanced hard work with genuine partnership, demonstrating that love built on authentic foundation could survive any material limitation. Most remarkably, the sisters maintained close relationship, no longer competing but genuinely supporting each other's happiness. They visited frequently, their children eventually growing up as cousins and best friends. They laughed about their summer of folly, acknowledging lessons learned through embarrassment and pain. They recognized Lord Sebastian Worthington's intervention with gratitude, maintaining cordial friendship with him and his wife when occasionally their paths crossed. One particular afternoon, perhaps 2 years after both weddings, found all 4 principals gathered at Hartwick Manor for casual family dinner. Edmund and Thomas conversed easily, having developed genuine friendship based on mutual respect. Beatrice and Georgiana supervised their respective infants whilst laughing about some household comedy. Lady Margaret, reconciled to arrangements that had initially horrified her, acknowledged privately that both her daughters seemed genuinely happy in ways social success might never have achieved. She had devoted her entire life to securing advantageous matches for them, pursuing financial stability and elevated status with single-minded determination. Yet watching them now, Beatrice engaged in animated discussion with Edmund about some medical innovation, Georgiana sharing comfortable silence with Thomas whilst their infant slept. She recognized they had found something considerably more valuable than mere security. They had discovered, through their own foolish and circuitous path, what she herself had never quite achieved: genuine contentment born of authentic partnership rather than social obligation. As evening deepened and conversation flowed naturally among people who had become family in truest sense, Beatrice caught Georgiana's eye across the drawing room. They shared a look that contained an entire silent conversation, the phantom memory of silk gowns and summer stratagems that had seemed so desperately important, the shared terror of revealing themselves to men they had carelessly dismissed, and finally, the quiet, unshakable joy of having chosen not the easier path society prescribed, but the one that had brought them home, not merely to love, but to each other, and ultimately to themselves. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society, though sometimes it requires a summer of folly, a season of wounded pride, and the intervention of a perceptive baron to open blind eyes to what stood plainly before them all along. The Hartwick sisters learned what many have learned before and after: that society's prizes often prove hollow, whilst genuine devotion, built on authentic foundation of mutual respect and affection, provides satisfaction no amount of fortune or status can match. For perhaps the greatest triumph in society is not securing the most coveted prize, but rather acquiring the wisdom to recognize true value where others see merely a physician and a soldier. The sisters Hartwick learned the most difficult lesson of all: that pride renders us blind to what matters most, but it is humility, and humility alone, that finally teaches us to see. One must confess, there exists a peculiar beauty in watching the foolish become wise, the blind learn to see, and sisters who competed learn instead to champion one another. Such transformations remind us that the human heart, for all its capacity for vanity and error, possesses an even greater capacity for growth, redemption, and ultimately for love that sees past gilded surfaces to the genuine gold beneath.